Hi, in this session we are going to be looking at a topic that is relevant to Year 10 and Year 12, so for GCSE and for A-Level. And for GCSE it's for Unit 1, which is about World Geography, Global Geography, and this is about Development Gap, and in Year 12 for AS or A-Level it's about Development Gap again obviously, and this is useful in the Globalisation unit or module. So what we're going to look at today is the development gap and how we measure development. So it's the very beginning of this section of globalisation. We're going to be looking at different indicators, and I'm just going to be talking you through the different indicators. So we're going to start off with economic indicators, and these indicators in the exam are sometimes called single indicators. So there's just one thing that measures development, and we look at the pros and cons in a little while as well. So we're going to start looking at economic indicators, and these are, we've got 4 of these. So the first 2 are quite similar. We have GNP, or Gross National Income, GNI I should say, Gross National Income, and GNI is the value of goods and earnings and services, so it's the amount of money that your country makes. And that's a very decent way of measuring development, because if a country is developed, then theoretically it should have quite a lot of income. So this is the wealth of the country, and often it is measured in GNI per capita, which means that it's divided theoretically by the number of people that live in that country. Now that's important because you might have a country like Canada, which has quite a lot of wealth but doesn't have many people, so theoretically Canada should be quite rich. Or you have somewhere like China, which has got a population of about 1.3 billion people and growing. And so that, if that wealth is divided by the number of people that live there, maybe the picture's not so great. So GDP or GNI per capita is how it's measured, and it gives us an indication of the wealth of the country. So that is GNI, and that includes overseas earnings. So GNI, Gross National Income, is overseas earnings. Now, secondly, similar to that is GDP. GDP is Gross Domestic Product. So this is slightly different. It's the same as the above, it's the value of the goods and services. However, it's only the domestic goods and services that's taken into account. So that's the goods and services that is from the country, inside the country, not outside the country. So again, that's measured in GDP per capita. However, sometimes this figure is measured, or all the time it's measured in US dollars. And if we get a figure for US dollars for Canada or America or somewhere in Europe, that's not going to give us the same information as if we get US dollars that maybe somewhere like Malawi or somewhere in Asia is Indonesia or maybe Vietnam, how much money they're making, because US dollars is a general amount, and so it's important that we look at what that money is worth within that country. So the way we do this is that we can often measure economic growth by using an indicator called PPP. Now PPP is purchase power parity, and what that means is this relates the average earnings to local prices and what your dollar can buy. So that makes a lot more sense, because $5 in America won't buy you very much, but $5 in somewhere like Malawi will buy you quite a lot of things. So that reflects the cost of living. So this is a little bit of a better indicator than just purely looking at wealth. And finally, we have something called ESB, which is basically the contribution that each sector brings to the wealth of the country. So that could be primary, if you remember, farming, secondary, manufacturing, or tertiary, which is services. So what we look at the ESB for each of the countries and the percentage of ESB. So I've put a couple of examples here. So Malawi's ESB for primary is 30%. It makes 30% of its money from primary products. The UK, however, because we are tertiary based with a little bit of some manufacturing, we only make 0.6% of our ESB from primary production. So you can see there that this gives a good indication of whether the country is wealthy and where that wealth is coming from. So you can look at the ESB percentage for each sector, and therefore you may be able to make a little bit of a better judgment about how developed the country is. If it has a high ESB in primary production, then that country is probably quite poor, because obviously primary jobs and primary goods don't give a lot of income, whereas secondary, that'll start developing a little bit, linking with our Clark-Fisher model from one of the other videos. And when we get into tertiary, into a lot of the high income countries, then we can see that the tertiary ESB will be quite high and primary will be quite low. Now, these economic indicators here, especially these top couple, these are what we call these single indicators, because it's just one indicator to give us the idea of wealth or development in the country. Now, that's not that great, because as I said before, if we just take GDP or GNI, we just take the wealth of the country, it doesn't tell us much about how many people live there or whether that wealth has been distributed among the people. So maybe countries like, let's say Saudi Arabia, for example, might be a good one, where its GNI might be very high, but if we look at individual people within that country or groups of people or average wages, etc., then you know, it's not doing as well as we might think. But Saudi Arabia will have a high income because it's got a lot of oil and natural resources. So these single indicators aren't always great at telling us the wealth of the country or the development of the country, because they are only single indicators and they often don't take into account whether that money is put towards services. So what do is we take a look at these next lot of indicators, which are social indicators. And these are what we call composite indicators, which means that they take several factors, several indicators, and put them together in the hope that they give us a bit of a better picture on measuring the level of development of that country and looking at how developed it is and whether it's rich or poor. So the first one, which hopefully we've all heard of from Key Stage 3, is HDI, the Human Development Index. Now, that's a fairly good indicator that comes from the United Nations. They introduced that a few years ago, and it takes into account 3 different single indicators, which you'll be aware of these single indicators from doing geography from year 7, 8 and 9. So it takes into account life expectancy, education in the form of literacy and the number of years that people spend in school, and GDP per capita, and in this instance it works out the PPP dollars, so how much purchase power we've got with those dollars, with that wealth. So that makes us a bit of a better indicator. So what this is doing is that this is seeing if the GDP is actually being spent on services and improving the development in that country and giving people opportunities, so to go to school, to have decent health, etc. So the life expectancy will tell us whether this money is being spent on healthcare, whether it's being spent on vaccinations for children, whether it's being spent on hospitals and doctors, etc. So if life expectancy is high, then we would assume that some of this, or quite a lot of this GDP, is being spent on healthcare. The next, education, is obviously really important, because obviously it tells us whether this money has been spent on sending students to school, how many students go to school, what level of education they've got, etc. So this is a much better, these multiple or composite ways of looking at development and the economy are much more accurate. So that gives us a really good picture as to whether the money, the GDP, the amount, or the GNI, is being spent in the correct way on services. If it's a poorer country, maybe like Malawi, then what we would expect is, I put here a figure which is between 0 and 1. So 0 is not a great figure to have, 1 is the best figure to have. So all countries come between 0 and 1. So right at the lower end of the scale, we've got countries like Malawi or other sub-Saharan African countries, some of the countries that are in a lot of debt, and they will come out nearer 1, maybe at like 0.4, 0.35, something like that. And that will tell us that the GDP or the GNI is not being spent because there isn't a lot of it, or the country may be corrupt, and so the HDI will be quite low. A country such as the UK or a Scandinavian country will come out pretty high, at above 0.9. Norway's quite high, the other Scandinavian countries, most of Europe, America, a lot of the high income countries, obviously very high, Australia, and they'll come out higher because obviously they're making more money, their GNI is higher, probably because their ESB is higher for tertiary, so it's giving them more money, and money is being spent on healthcare and education. So the HDI, the Human Development Index, will show a much higher figure, telling us that that development is better within that country, and that measure of development has shown this. The next one is a slightly newer one, which is very important because this is the GII, and this is the Gender Inequality Index. And we economists have started to look at this in a little bit more detail over the past decade or so, because this takes into account the role of women. And the more developed a country is, then one would hope that the role of women is more positive and the opportunities for women are greater. So this looks at 3 areas. It looks at reproductive health of women, so it looks whether women are dying whether they're dying when they're giving birth. It also looks at fertility rates, etc. It looks at average amounts of children that women have. If it's a poorer country, then we're probably going to get more women dying in giving birth. And if it's a poorer country, we're probably going to find that women are having more babies and fertility rates are higher because women are having babies from a younger age to an older age, so fertility rates are quite high. Secondly is it looks at equality in terms of women in politics. So it looks at the amount of women that are involved in different parties and are involved in the government. And that's often a really good indication that the country is quite developed because there'll be quite a lot of women in politics taking up roles within local politics or national politics. So that's the second part of that indicator. And the third is levels of education for women. So it looks at the amount of qualifications a woman has and whether they've been to university, and job opportunities, what jobs women are doing afterwards as well. So this one is a really nice indicator to look at the role of women. So again, you might find that within poorer countries, the role of women generally, not always, is a lot maybe lower, and women aren't having those opportunities and they're dying during childbirth, etc. Mortality rates are quite high in that instance, whereas in richer countries, more developed countries, then the GII will indicate that women have got better opportunities. So these are social indicators, and they are composite or multiple indicators. They take several things into account, and they tend to be more accurate, as I said before. And finally, what we have is more recently, as we're looking at environmental indicators and looking at that as a measure of development. Now, here, generally, as economic development increases, so as we move from primary into secondary, then quality of the environment generally decreases. And that's due to the fact that if most of the population are involved in primary production, then the amount of CO2 that's released, because the amount of electricity that needs to be generated, etc., is often lower. The amount of mechanisation will be lower. So the air quality in places like sub-Saharan Africa will actually be quite high in terms of measuring in the atmosphere carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide and particulates, things like that. Then you'll tend to find that as economic development increases, then the environmental indicators will decrease. That's what generally happens up until a country becomes a middle income country. So from a low income country to a middle income country, we would expect environmental quality to decrease. And that's because, like I said, in a lower income country, most of the jobs are in agriculture, which doesn't produce as much air pollution anyway. And as we move into secondary and we're manufacturing, China's a really good example of this. The environmental or the air quality will be very, very poor. So that is an indicator that the country is developing. However, as we move from middle to high income countries, we often get a increase in environmental quality. And we can see that in Europe and the UK. That's really obvious here. In the UK, our environmental quality overall is much, much better than that in China, especially Chinese cities. And that is because we don't manufacture as much as maybe they do in China. We always also have catalytic converters in our cars. We have a lot of policies which aim to reduce the amount of pollutants that get put into the atmosphere from industry. So there's a lot more environmental laws as the government increases its power and becomes is better governed, etc. And companies are held account for their pollution. So we tend to find that in Western countries, in higher income countries, as levels of development increase, then environmental quality increases as well. So we've got good environmental quality in a very poor country. We've got very bad quality of the environment in a middle income country as it develops. So lots of places in Asia. And then we've got environmental quality increasing again as the country develops further overall. So we can use environmental indicators to look at levels of development. I would suggest that lots of these can be used in conjunction with each other because obviously not every country will fit into this. So we need to look at multiple indicators in order to see whether that country is developed or not, and therefore what the development gap is. Now, we can measure the development gap using an index called the Gini index. And this goes from 0 to 1. And this can measure equality or inequality within a country as well, because we don't just have rich countries and poor countries, but we have rich areas or poor areas within countries as well. So the Gini index shows that if it has a 0 rating, then that shows that that country has perfect equality. So that means, in theory, that every person within that country has an equal amount of wages, which is kind of never going to happen. So something around a 0 is not going to happen, but the closer to 0 it is, then it shows that there is less inequality between the richest person and the poorest person. And a 0 would mean that everybody gets the same wages. Now, a figure of 1 shows perfect inequality. So if a country got 1, for the way the Gini index has worked out, I'm not going to go over that in this video, I might do it in another one. We would imagine that there's one person who's earns all the wages in that country, and everyone else has nothing. So every country is going to be between 0 and 1. So that is a good measure of overall development, because the more developed a country is, then theoretically the less of a gap there is between its richest and its poorest. But sometimes that doesn't work sometimes. So again, we have to take these indicators all together. Now, what we're trying to say here with these indicators is that the development gap with globalisation, this is our link in year 12 to globalisation, is that as globalisation has developed or as globalisation has increased, then the development gap is said to have increased. So if we compare now, our economies now, world economies now, to maybe 100 years ago, then we are richer, but the richest countries are much, much richer, and the poorest countries, although they've got richer over time, there's a huge gap between the poorest and the richest. Whereas maybe 100 years ago, we were all a lot poorer, and the poor countries were very, very poor. The richest countries were obviously still richer, the USA and Europe, but the gap between the two was a lot less. So what we're saying with the development gap is that globalisation has increased the economy of most places within the world. However, the richest portion of the world has got much, much richer. So that gap between rich and poor has increased. And these indicators are ways that we can measure the developments in each country, and therefore look at the development gap between the richest and the poorest. And then look at what policies can be put in place, etc., leading on to other parts of the course. So that is development gap, and that was about measuring development within each country.